Deadman Mode, an attempt by Jagex to make RuneScape into the world of esports. Now, in this video I want to talk about why Deadman Mode failed, or rather the many problems that Deadman Mode actually had. Now, don't get me wrong, Deadman Mode had a lot of problems, a lot of specific ones at that, and this video is gonna mostly go on an over general idea of what actually happened, as opposed of making an exhaustive history of what Deadman Mode was. So, for those of you who don't know, Deadman Mode was essentially a worse version of Darkscape. Yes, that's something I said, and that's something I'll stick by. No, but seriously, essentially, Deadman Mode is a game mode where, just like normal RuneScape, you progress through the game. The caveat is that while there are safe zones, the vast majority of the game is entirely PvP. And unlike the Wilderness PvP, where you have combat brackets, no, just entirely PvP. Anyone can attack you. Some zones are multiple, so you can have multiple people on top of you, including entire clans. And if you die, you lose the 10 most valuable items in your bank, as well as a bunch of XP from skills that weren't protected. So ultimately, it's a really punishing game mode that is, well, appealing to PvP players. So really, why did it fail? What were the problems with it? And, well, I think that at its core, Deadman Mode was just a bad competitive game. Ultimately, Deadman Mode was an accelerated version of RuneScape. RuneScape being an MMORPG where you progress, you earn your progress, and you keep that progress. The problem with progress in RuneScape in general and MMORPGs is that while part of it is down to skill, a lot of it is actually down to how long you spend in the game. And there's nothing wrong with it. We love playing RuneScape because, hey, it's a time sink that many of us have. However, when it comes to competitiveness, and especially when it comes to the world of esports, time spent in a game is not a metric you want to attribute to players or success. Usually, you want it to be down to skill, just pure displays of skill. And while obviously the longer you spend in a game, the better you will be at it, ultimately, Deadman Mode wasn't a display of skill. A lot of the gear plays a huge part in how good you are and how much you eat, etc. etc. So ultimately, if I spend 8 hours in the game every day and you spend 2, I will probably achieve things that are much better than yours. So even if you are better than me at the game, I can still easily beat you for the most part. And because of that, Deadman Mode usually is a game mode that actually rewards players spending a lot of time in the game, not players that are actually really good at it. It rewards time spent playing, not skill. When you couple this with the fact that the vast majority of players that already play the game a lot are the ones that are good at it, you just make the balance even more unequal. You see, when it comes to esports in general and games in general, they are usually marked by two very distinct, interesting things. Number one, they are short things that you can just play and disconnect at any time you want. You don't actually need to be there for 3 months creating your account. Rather, you go in, usually an hour, maybe half an hour, maybe hour and a half, and you're done with the game, and you can just move on to the next game. The second characteristic is that, for the most part, there's no time spent in the game metric. When you start playing the game, you start playing the game at the same time as everyone else. Your progress as everyone else progresses, and inevitably you have a clear objective that wins or loses you the game, right? The problem with Deadman Mode is that you just didn't have that. Deadman Mode started as being a 3 month long battle royale that at the end of the day you would have at the last hour a fog encroaching through Gillinor, and then the last person standing would win $10,000. That was pretty much it. And obviously, when you have that, you don't really have the space to show a lot of skill. And while the novelty at the beginning was interesting, and a lot of players liked really watching it, especially as it was the most watched game on Twitch when Deadman Mode Final Hour was around. Ultimately, the novelty were off. And as the novelty were off, a lot of players stopped playing. And as a lot of players stopped playing, Deadman Mode stopped being as popular. Now, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of players that still watch or like to watch Deadman Mode as opposed to playing it themselves. They didn't have the time, they didn't have the skill, they didn't want to participate, but they wanted to watch other people participate. But, well, here's where you run into another issue. So you already have the game having a bad core for competitiveness because it doesn't reward skill, it rewards time spent into the game. Well, when it comes to the hardcore player base, eventually with so many additions of Deadman Mode and considering that your progress is wiped, not a lot of players after a while wanted to redo all the quests, redo all the mini games, and redo all the skills and everything, and get all the gear and all of these grinds all over again just to get to that point of having a chance of winning the game, right? Eventually, you burn out, you grow tired of it, and you just simply move on. So now we don't have the casual players, but you also don't have the hardcore players because most of them are burning out essentially. To make everything even worse, on top of that, you also have the fact that, well, as Deadman Mode went on, players started being wiser to the way you play it. They started being far more safe, they started playing in clans and big teams, so, even though it is a game mode where you can just kill everyone, ultimately, if there's a game mode and there's people playing it, and if Killenor Games has taught us anything, is that if there's people, there's going to be alliances. So eventually, that's exactly what happened. Most clans would dominate the game, and since you have PvP everywhere, the clans would just essentially park themselves and overthrow you by sheer numbers. Again, time spent, not so much skill, in certain areas of the game that would essentially impede you of getting specific quests and specific gear, so you wouldn't actually be able to get that gear or get that supplies or whatever it was. So now you have the hardcore players that don't really want to play the game, even if they can handle all of the grinds and don't get burned out, because essentially, what's the point? The clans will just dominate you and you won't be able to do anything. So you have a player base that is in decline. You don't really have a lot of people then to watch play the game mode. Well, I mean, what's left to do? Well, what's left is the fact that Jagex continuously changed the game mode in order to make it more fresh or make it more, fair for solo players and everything. And all of that failed, and it failed specifically because it took away from the identity of what game or Deadman Mode was. Deadman Mode was a game where you would build your account for 3 months with all of the dangers of losing all of your progress, which is a thing that players don't like to do because again it's more time spent as opposed of skill, where after 3 months, your account would be wiped out, and you would have an opportunity of winning $10,000 by being the last person standing in the fog. Now it's a game mode where you have 4 weeks to build your account, be in the top 2000, and then eventually, if you are in the top 2000, you qualify for the next phase, and then you have another week to rebuild yet another account, or like keep building your account or whatever, and then in the final hour, you have a bunch of 1v1s until, one person stands. The game mode has changed so much and it's so irrecognizable that at this point it's really hard to even follow all of the changes and of everything that was going on. And well, if you thought that the game mode itself wasn't that competitive and didn't reward skill, this is where the problems really started to come in. Because if it wasn't enough that the casual players lost the novelty and as a result didn't want to play, the hardcore players didn't want to play, and then most players didn't want to play because of the clans, well, now you start getting into the territory of DDoSing. Because yes, on top of all of that, and because we're talking about RuneScape community at the end of the day, because of course we're not going to behave, essentially what happened is the fact that at every final, a bunch of players would DC. and they would disconnect, and as a result they couldn't log back in and they were essentially eliminated. So now not only are you essentially building your account for an entire month that is already hard enough to do because of all the bullshit that you have to deal with, on top of all of that, you build all of that, you go through all of that just to disconnect at the end of the day. Yes, it's rough, but it isn't the end, because there's something even worse at the end. Because enter ModJed. Yes, the Jagex moderator and developer that essentially hacked accounts in one of the game modes, since he was part of Reign of Terror once upon a time, essentially fed them the information where the final place for the competition, Deadman Mode, was going to be, which means that they were there first and were able to just kill anyone that was passing by and essentially just set themselves in the fort and just, well, they castled, right? And that is even worse. And the thing is, after all of these, you have to remember there's money on the line. There's $10,000 on the line. And this is to not talk about all of the funny scenarios of people being on stage and all of them being dead, or the fact that Wooks won one of the Deadman modes, but he didn't won because he wasn't fighting with other players and that was a shit show on its own. Look, essentially, Deadman mode is so full of controversies that on top of a game mode that is already not that good when it comes to the competitive sense, you now have to deal with all of the bullshit that the community is pulling off and that the developers are also pulling off. Because ultimately, there was another issue. At the end of the day, Jagex didn't exactly support the game mode that much. What I mean by this is that while it did have a budget for, stuff like stage events and prize pools, at the end of the day, the developers developing Deadman Mode were still Jagex developers, right? The ones that make content for the main game to begin with. So when you have them developing Deadman Mode, most of the times they're not paying full attention to the PvP scene or the Deadman Mode. When they are developing stuff, they are developing stuff purely for the base experience of the game, and then you just throw money at something, yeah, of course it's not gonna work. Of course it's not gonna pay off. At the end of the day, look at Fortnite. They held a $100 million tournament, and everyone thought, yeah, this is going to be the future. This is going to be the next esport. And then everyone remembered that, wait, throwing money at something doesn't make it a good esport. And I see this is not just a Jagex problem, by the way. Many companies throw money at something in a competitive tournament type thing with a huge prize pool, and then they don't have a competitive scene, and then they wonder what they did wrong. And that's because right now the most popular esports are League of Legends and Counter-Strike. And those have remained the most popular esports. None of them has ever had a $100 million prize pool tournament. And that's because throwing money at something doesn't necessarily make it competitive. Yeah, you'll make it competitive while the prize pool is there, but it's unsustainable to throw that big of a prize pool into every single tournament you do. You need a grassroots competitive scene. And when you grab games like League of Legends or Counter-Strike, which are pure skill-based experiences, right, that players have always played not because of prize pools, because in the time that Counter-Strike was getting big, we didn't have prize pools. We had LAN houses where you would play against the other people in the LAN house purely for bragging rights. You just wanted the fucking bragging right of saying that you were better than your friends. That's all it took. It was a competitive game that we enjoyed playing, and we enjoyed saying that we were better than others. And that's how a competitive scene grew out of Counter-Strike, right? People had an interest in competing, people had an interest in watching the best, and as a result, tournaments grew, teams grew, right? Jagex didn't have that. And this is to not get into the problem of where are the tools for the support? Like, it's not easy to observe Deadman Mode on your own. It's not easy to make your own content out of it as an observer. It's not easy to replay it. It's not. Essentially, what I'm trying to say is that as an esport, there are very few, if no tools at all, when it came to Deadman Mode to help its experience. Which begs the question, can RuneScape actually be made into a competitive game mode? Is Deadman Mode the first and last thing that we're ever gonna have when it comes to competition in RuneScape? And I would say that it's actually really easy to make competitiveness in RuneScape because we already have it, be it in speedrunning worlds, be it in EHP competitions, PVM competitions, or, well, PvP competitions. Other content creators have made pretty successful PvP tournaments. Last Man Standing is still popping off today, and while PvP Arena isn't that popular, all things considered, there is a group of very dedicated people that really like playing in PvP Arena and really like to, well, brag that they are amongst the best when it comes to 1v1 PvP in the PvP Arena. So ultimately, you already have the competitiveness here. All you need right now, and instead of just throwing money into prize pools that won't actually do anything, is to just develop tools for these communities. Why not create a world where it's, like PvP Arena or Last Man Standing, where instead of actually going into a lobby or whatever, it's a much easier matchmaking system where you can more easily see the rank of other players and the rank of your account, for example, so people can more easily play against each other. Why don't you hire someone specifically to develop tools, not just to organize stuff in that world, so you can easily organize tournaments, for example, but also to observe them, to make replays, for example, available. And especially now with the Jagex launcher and everything, is it really gonna be that hard to maybe even make a PvP version of the game that you can just launch on the side, so it's purely PvP? The point is, Jagex really just needs to help with tools the community, because if there's any competitiveness to be had, people will want it. People will want bragging rights. What they need, however, is Jagex support, especially when it comes to tools. Throwing money at something doesn't solve the problem. Throwing money at things doesn't really create a competitive scene. What creates a competitive scene is you supporting it by giving them tools that allow them to be competitive, that allow them to publicize that competitiveness, and just essentially fuck around with it. Some speedrun games have 3 people running it and they still run it. What matters are the tools and the community behind it. The prize pool comes after, not before. And that was a terrible mistake that Jagex happened since the beginning. Now, again, as I mentioned, don't get me wrong, there are many, many, many other problems with Deadman Mode that led it to it failing. But essentially, from the beginning, the game mode wasn't that good, the novelty were off, clans took over, DDoSing ensued, Modjed did something that was kind of fucked up, all things considered, and when it comes to this, the vast majority of players look at this and they don't care about the game mode. There's nothing to care about. It's a corpse, and Jagex hasn't run the final yet, and when they do, there's going to be more DDoSing, because that is the staple of Deadman Mode at this point. Every final will have DDoSing. And when most players look at this, is it really no wonder why most people don't actually even want Deadman Mode to be a thing? At the end of the day, the development time that is going into Deadman Mode could be going into any other thing in the game. Again, Deadman Mode doesn't have its own developers. The PvP scene doesn't have its own development. It's all, the same developers that already make content for the main game. So when you're faced with that, would you rather have a game mode that is failed continuously time after time after time to make an impact, comparatively speaking, or to have those developers work on something for the actual game, an update for the actual main game? Yeah, many people would want the developers to just make a piece of content for the actual game, not for Deadman Mode. And all things considered, you can't really blame them. But as I mentioned, there can be a path forward. You have the PvP arena, you have the last man standing, you can make an impact with those. And I really hope the Jagex doesn't ignore them.